Good morning. Um, so today I'll continue my critique and presentation of notes on The Psychic Life of Power by Judith Butler. If you recount in the prior couple of videos, we did go through chapters 1 and 2 and the introduction, moving from the question of bad conscience and resentment in Hegel to stubborn attachments, and finally to bodily subjection in the second chapter. Just going through the subheadings briefly. In any case, circuits of bad conscience in the second chapter. In any case, if you've not seen those videos, I would encourage you to go to them. You'd find them on the channel itself, and you will find the text attached in the description. Now, without any other introductions, let's get to the question. Notes on and critique of Chapter 3 of The Psychic Life of Power between Freud and Foucault. In the third chapter, the author takes up, or rather expands on, a Foucauldian understanding of subjection. Here, it is important to note that, as with Foucault, whose own conceptualization regarding discipline and punishment often began with a prisoner as an example of a subject deprived of agency, the conception of subjectivation here is understood not as an identification made by the subject in a call or some other process of social recognition, but as formative of the very subject itself. In this sense, notwithstanding the author's emphasis on a differentiation between formation and determination or causing, at the very least, we see here the pole of agency resting with the discourse, which produces a subject rather than perhaps an option exercised by a subject from a position of agency. The concept of subjection in question, taken up, is said to neither dominate the subject nor to produce it. Rather, it is said to designate a certain kind of restriction in production, a restriction without which the production of the subject cannot take place, a restriction through which that production takes place. End of quote. Here, it would appear that we seem to be entertaining a managerial understanding of subjection as being a restriction placed upon production, yet a restriction which is said to be required for the subject to take place, and without which production cannot take place. The influence of structuralism is unmistakable in Foucault's thought, with the metaphor of a prison being used to depict the soul which is regulated by the imprisoning effect of its delimiting concept. I think an interesting adaptation of structuralist principles may be employed in considering the concept of a prison whose spatial effect makes the soul, as put by the author, into something perhaps more akin to a practice whose disciplinary effects constitute those formations of selfhood, indeed identification with the soul or subjection. And I am sure this would be an angle Let me repeat this section if it was difficult to assimilate. The influence of structuralism is unmistakable in Foucault's thought, with the metaphor of a prison being used to depict the soul, which is regulated by the imprisoning effect of its delimiting concept. I think an interesting adaptation of structuralist principles may be employed in considering the concept of a prison whose spatial effect makes the soul, as put by the author, into something more akin to a practice whose disciplinary effects constitute those formations of selfhood, identification with a soul, or indeed subjection. And I am sure this would be an angle found to be immanent to the thought of Foucault himself, even if he would like to distance himself from the position of an author. In this sense, the soul would correspond to the subject's psyche in the psychoanalytic sense. There are, however, curious assertions made regarding the correspondence or identity of the ego ideal and superego. A traditional psychoanalytic reading often takes the superego to be a regulator of the ego ideal, a point of reference or film, as it were, which, which allows the subject to reflect and posit that which it may wish to construct as an ideal. In this sense, would not the subject occasionally, and perhaps as a defensive formation, seek to withdraw or conceal the ego ideal from the superego? And would not this be another possible account or model for the Lacanian notion of the split subject? This is a lesson which is perhaps best enunciated in discourse, or as Wittgenstein's last assertion in the Tractatus puts before us, whereof one cannot speak, there we must be silent. Symbolic, according to Lacan, is offered. The position of the subject within the symbolic, the norm that installs the subject within language, and hence within available schemes of cultural transmission. And while there may be more precise ways to define this, I think this may yet serve as a handy introduction. What the author lays before us as an aim for this chapter is an evaluation of the earlier described and its reduction to perhaps a more traditional concept of the soul. An observation which would appear to avoid meeting the idea, perhaps misinformed, that the psyche as such is perhaps more readily understood as the state of an individual's associations registered mentally. And while prosaic, a soul usually bore with it an attachment to a sense of narrative, if for nothing to allow for the subject's capacity of self-representation. And here, the author does make a welcome argument identifying in the concept of the soul as understood as an imprisoning effect a certain limitation in being able to resist normative prescriptions, compromising as such its own subject formation. A clear measure taken to secure for the subject its ability to constitute its subjectivating principle, as it were, whose insistence we noticed earlier. The ability to formulate a resistance to such forces is a line of inquiry raised, and a constructive study is introduced which seeks to ascertain as to what psychoanalysis may learn from this. The creative question to ask here would of course be, what does this resistance do? If the importance of its faculty as a principle may allow for a measure of self-determinacy in subject formation has not already been made clear. And while resistance may allow for a capacity to distance oneself from inscriptions or norms of producing a docile body, this resistance itself is not the same as dismantling or changing the terms offered for subject formation. The more interesting question here, which is also presented, is whether the unconscious or psyche, when characterized as constituted by resistance, may we discern in it strong attachments which permit for or facilitate this capacity as such. The author states that these unconscious attachments are an example of subjection, that they may indeed be an unconscious subjection. Yet, what kind of subjection would fail to recognize itself in the address that it understands itself to be subject to? This would imply that the unconscious is no more free from normalizing discourse than the subject. End of quote. There was a line, that phrase about the unconscious. This proposition, however, would fail at accounting for the capacity of a discursive inquiry, such as psychoanalysis is, to be able to interpret the symptoms and fantasies of the subject's discourse by positing them as already apparent, if only in their unfreedom from normativity. The subject we have here appears then to be a subject already revealed, whose subjection is already determined, symptoms already posited, and whose fantasy already realized. Indeed, the direction chosen by this inquiry does seem to posit its own object of study, if you will. Quote, if we find an attachment to subjection at the level of the unconscious, what kind of resistance is it to be wrought from? Is to be wrought from that. End of quote. Here, I would state that an attachment to subjection may be necessary for the pursuit of an inquiry. And if the only aim of such a pursuit is to garner or perhaps mine a resource of resistance, then we may ultimately have a subject which is resistant to the discourse in question. The far more productive question which does follow is whether a resistance, whether conscious or unconscious, to normalizing injunctions, which perhaps prohibit such an injunction to completely constitute its object, is able to alter or expand dominant injunctions or interpellations of subject formation. Here, indeed, I do see a recognition of a certain unproductive kind of resistance, unproductive kind of resistance, unproductive for any subject, which can only undermine but which appears to have no power to rearticulate the terms, ellipses, by which subjects are constituted, by which subjection is installed in the very formation of the subject. This resistance establishes the incomplete character of any effort to produce a subject by disciplinary means, but it remains unable to rearticulate the dominant terms of productive power. End of quote. The instructive insight, which I may not have touched on here earlier, is of course the author's adoption of the Foucauldian approach to thinking the body as a site of investment for power, as opposed to subjection, pure and simple. This does seem to be approaching a terrain which seems to lose any traditional mooring in an idea of the socius, however, which an inquiry into, quote, the manner in which what is most material and vital in them, bodies, has been invested, end of quote, a history of bodies, as it were. Indeed, our prior references to practices would seem well founded when the question of what constitutes an investment for the body as conceived as a site of power, that is, not a receptacle or vessel, but perhaps a domain or ground contested by powers and perhaps their admixtures. In her consideration of the position of the subject along such lines, a position from which I do not exclude that of the reader, and of course their own dependencies or subjections, if you prefer, but also their readings and interpretations. The very faculty this work in question is an appeal to, we may discern a consideration of subjection per se, which does not blind itself in a moment of insight, such as a revelatory vision or inspiration, choosing rather to linger on the capacities of a subject traversed by these forces. This is a work of care for such a subject to become, but also an archaeology in the Foucauldian sense of the term, of the forms of life already as it sees through their lineaments. There are certain formulations regarding the relation between the body of the subject and their soul, effectuated, as it were, in subjection, which may posit them at cross purposes. And while such a formulation is clearly not metaphysical, trying to discern an argument beyond what was initially attributed as a Foucauldian assertion, which points out that the body is in some way used up in the process of production, would be difficult to follow and may perhaps call for some linguistic innovation. Yet we may discern an appreciation of the Foucauldian engagement with the sexuality of discourse in its appraisal of excesses or resistances which seek to exceed the normative parameters provided. Another assertion is made, however, which introduces the notion of discursive complexity, undermining the teleological aims of normalization. Here, I think there may be an assumption made that normalization has teleological aims, an observation which Foucault's critique of epistemes, for instance, may be read as an account of. An observation, or rather, a taking up of one made by Nietzsche in the genealogy of morals regarding the designification of the sign change deserves mention. There, Nietzsche argues that the uses to which a given sign is originally put to are worlds apart from the uses to which it then becomes available. This is perhaps the movement which is the hardest to trace from within a genealogical register, given the investment in this domain of attributes, qualities, distinguishing marks, signatures, and other testaments, which constitute or help produce what may be called singularity effects. Perhaps in some ways not unlike a contract which ties a basket of commodities to each other under fixed prices for the making of a batch. There seems to be a more fundamental topographical question raised here regarding whether thinking a genealogy is able to come to terms with or commiserable with exchange, and the difficulty I point out seeks to, in some ways, account for that. A difficulty which I might add a properly dialectical critique seeks to make comprehensible. An emphasis is placed on the incomplete nature of the subjection in question, which the Foucauldian construction of the subject seeks to account for. A subjection which may be discerned in a repetition which militates against its origin, a phrase which any psychoanalytic understanding of drive would seek to account for, yet perhaps entertain an understanding of symptoms exhibited by the subject, seeking to interpret them and noticing their sublimated potential and perhaps manifestation in fantasies. I would like to draw attention to a way in which a problem of interiority and exteriority are constituted in a discourse, or rather a way in which this problem is broached by the author. Quote, becomes available in the act of enunciation, an exteriority formed by the act of enunciation itself. This may be only exterior to the subject of the statement itself, such as, for example, the slips in speech, which Freud may discern as symptoms in which an unconscious may be glimpsed. 2. The other way in which this exteriority could be constituted is as the barred subject, which retroactively posits the ground for a discourse, a qualifying statement, if you will, much like an unwritten code or background, as it were, against which a discourse is formed. What both of these positions would have in common, especially if we were to remain consistent with our psychoanalytic or Lacanian perspective, is a commitment to interpret subject formation as possible only in addressing the other. And here it is important to emphasize the other not merely as another body, but another symbolic order or logic, if you prefer. This, I think, is an important section, so I will repeat it slowly and try and explain any hiccups that you may have along the way. I would like to draw attention to a way in which a problem of interiority and exteriority are constituted in a discourse, or rather, a way in which this problem is broached by the author. Quote, "What can we make of the way in which discourses not only constitute the domain of the speakable, but are themselves bound to the production of a constitutive outside, the unspeakable, the unsignifiable?" End of quote. There may be two ways in which we interpret this particular construction. 1. In speech, even in active first-person speech, there becomes available in the act of enunciation an exteriority formed by the act of enunciation itself. And this may be only exterior to the subject of the statement itself. So if I were, for example, to say that, my name is Arsh, and if the way in which I say it says something about how I find myself in a certain circumstance, that meaning that may be interpreted or derived is in some ways distinct from the name that I utter in the sentence. That's the idea. And that's the difference between the subject of the statement and the subject of enunciation. It's a difference made by Lacan, and it is also taken to be an example of what the split subject is in psychoanalysis conceptually, a way in which it manifests itself. 2. The other way in which could be constituted is the barred subject, which actively posits the ground for a discourse, a qualifying statement, if you will, much like an unwritten code or background, as it were, against which a discourse is formed. What both of these positions would have in common, especially if we were to remain consistent with our psychoanalytic or Lacanian perspective, is a commitment to interpret subject formation as possible only in addressing the other. And here it is important to emphasize that the other is not merely another body, but another symbolic order, or logic, if you prefer. And this is tied to the notion of the Lacanian subject, which in some ways constitutes itself in its addressal of the other, which we may get into later. These terms, however, may require a redrafting in comparison with the Foucauldian subject, which the author has been seeking to present a critique of. Quote, "If, according to psychoanalysis, the subject is not the same as the psyche from which it emerges, and if for Foucault the subject is not the same as the body from which it emerges, then perhaps the body has come to substitute for the psyche in Foucault, that is, as that which exceeds and confounds the injunctions of normalization." End of quote. There may be rather interesting ways in which this earlier category of the other may be interpreted here. and indeed the Foucauldian inspiration, or rather influence, on studies of sexuality are well documented. Indeed, as sexualized as the category of the subject may be in terms of how the subject may self-identify themselves or find themselves identified in a call, if you prefer, you may yet have to return, or rather we may yet have to return to the Althusserian conception of interpellation, a concept whose signifying force does bear the influence in the use of social categories. Another interesting use would be the way the category of the imaginary, with its Lacanian relations to the symbolic and the real, is mobilized by the author to represent something akin to a site of resistance. This would be a resistance which may safeguard the individual in their sense of interiority at the expense of never entering the domain of the symbolic, which would frame a kind of exposure. Nor would it be able to redirect the law invoked by the author, though what is left unclear is the relation of this law to the production of the subject. In this sense, I would not be able to discern as to whether framing the relation, or rather the possibility of such a site of resistance, to reframe or challenge the law is of any use, given that it does not appear to alter the constitution of the subject in any way, which the author of this text, Judith Butler, is willing to present in this chapter. Yet, resistance for the author seems to be formally placed here so as to present a site of critique to power, almost on the condition that it may not alter the law. And here, what appears to be posited is not a law regarding the production of the subject, but a law regarding a formal, though perhaps admittedly ineffectual resistance to power, which in these terms is unable to regulate it. From within such formulations, however, regarding the relation of the law to the imaginary and resistance to power, the author does seem to suggest a new conception of the subject, which is claimed to divulge from the Lacanian framework. Quote, "The insistence on the dual possibility of being both constituted by the law and an effect of resistance to the law marks a departure." End of quote. Yet does this description resemble what the traditional idea of courtship entailed anyway? Let me repeat that. This insistence on the dual possibility of being both constituted by the law and an effect of resistance to the law marks a departure. An entertainment of the idea whose consideration is permitted under the name of a law against which it may yet appeal. Courtship, as I see it. Where I believe such a conception would yet entail, even if it does not recognize its debt to Lacan's concept of the subject in terms of the split between the subject and the object petit a, whose constitutive allure, as it were, rests in the other. And here, I believe the author seems to be bypassing the difficulty as well as the possibilities presented by Lacan, who appears to serve rather as a gatekeeper to an altar of some kind before which only the ambiguous notion of the law stands. Here we should mention that Foucault may offer novel formulations in considering resistance here as a productive category, or rather as an effect of the very power it opposes. Indeed, were a logic of such epistemic adaptation, if I may, were to be extended to not the body itself, but to the practices, discursive and disciplinary, which produce the body, including, of course, the relations between them, forming our notion of the social body or corpus, we may recognize indeed a new formation of the subject, produced as the site of an active and live resistance to power, capable of forming, articulating, and practicing logics which may create forms of life that are no longer subsumable within an earlier understanding. The author does, however, assert that Foucault recasts the symbolic as relations of power. And while this may not be a description, it does draw on something of the lack of trepidation which characterizes the effort in his work to anticipate the undermining, or rather subversion, of the conceptual or historical innovation in question, which the author here chooses to identify with the site of the Lacanian symbolic. The author does not seem to be entirely unaware of these difficulties. However, she recognizes that even in this Foucauldian organization of the subject as a productive resistance to power, or perhaps as an epistemic challenge to its disciplinary apparatus, the presentation of disciplinary discourse in Foucault does not unilaterally constitute the subject, but rather implicates its own formation in its very act of their enunciation, providing, as it were, conditions for the subject's deconstitution. And by this, we would have to include everything from cynical subversions of intent to redeployments of conceptual apparatuses. These following perversions, as it were, fail to grasp the psychoanalytic notion of a split subject in the construction of the sexual antagonism of discourse, of which it does and is a constituting agent. And here, even the subversion of, let us say, a disciplinary practice, or, God forbid, the theft of the object petit a, would serve under the law of the split subject as both advertising the object under consideration and forcing a reinterpretation of it in presenting it to another gaze. Alas, this theft is not a theft of the capacity of a subject to form their object of desire, inasmuch as it is a theft of the potential a discourse saw in an object which warranted a reach for it. Perhaps the subject may learn from these limitations, as it were, and decide to posit that which it finds reactionary in order to spur a progressive reterritorialization. This procedure, however, is what is recognized as a disciplinary apparatus, and what is accounted for in some measure is the process by which such a disciplinary apparatus produces subjects. The production of such subjects is what brings into question the possibility of subverting the apparatus itself. Or, to quote the author, the law turns against itself and spawns versions of itself, which oppose and proliferate its animating purpose. The strategic question for Foucault is then, how can we work the power relations by which we are worked, and in what direction? End of quote. We also see an apprehension of class relations and their effects on social formations by the author, in rather brutally succinct ways, even if they prefigure a certain understanding of what the liberal state is. Quote, in his later interviews, Foucault suggests that identities are formed within contemporary political arrangements in relation to certain requirements of the liberal state, one that assume that the assertion to rights and claims to entitlement can only be made on the basis of a claim to a singular and injured identity. The more specific identities become, the more totalized an identity becomes, by that very specificity. End of quote. And I think this does in many ways introduce us to, for example, the Althusserian conception of overdetermination, of how, for example, the class matrix, if you prefer, or the relations of classes to each other required for the mode of production to continue, in their act of scaling up the economy, create more and more specialized jobs. And this is what I guess is implied or entailed in the idea that the more specific identities become, the more they retroactively exclude the possibilities for certain kinds of divergences from a totalization required as a disciplinary apparatus for them to function as nodes in the economy as they may be. I think Zizek makes another version of such a predicament quite nicely apparent when he states that in modern society, political correctness and its normativity often lead to a place where we are unconsciously probed, not merely to obey certain norms, but even in our act of violating them. Let us say when we take a quick break from our job, to do so in a way which can be arranged and accounted for, effectively delimiting the space of real freedom. And I think this is where the Marxian critique of ideology does come in, about how our very enjoyment is regulated in ways which are unconsciously affected by cultural capitalism and ideologies, religious indoctrinations and things of that kind. Not to mention, of course, narcotics and the peddling of drugs, prescriptions, large pharmacies making a profit. To make clear the predicament presented here, allow me to quote another line by the author. In this sense, what we call identity politics is produced by a state which can only allocate recognition and rights to a subject totalized by the particularity which constitutes their plaintiff status. End of quote. The author recognizes that the totalizing production of individuals extends the jurisdiction of the state via the process of subjectivation itself, my emphasis. And this does lead to Foucault to raise a call for the remaking of subjectivity beyond the juridical law. I believe there is a sense of justice marked when the author recognizes in Foucault not a will to represent a subjectivity whose very forms of revolt are already earmarked by the state, not a hidden or repressed subjectivity as put by the author, but, quote, for a radical remaking of subjectivity formed against the dominant historical hegemony. End of quote. I do, however, find the representation of the formation of the subject by the author as one which emerges through an attachment to a founding prohibition to be perhaps a displacement of what in psychoanalytic terms would be known as the barred subject, or as Lacan algebraically frames it, the crossed S, which allows for the construction of a discourse, indeed a founding prohibition as it were. Yet subject formation cannot be reduced to the primal scene of a family, for birth cannot be the only subject. Were we to witness a birth, for example, our ability to bear witness to it, let us say the beginning of a new movement in a form of composition, etc., and to be able to retroactively determine for ourselves what that event meant for us is what would make our testimony a subject of fidelity and our act perhaps, in the words of the author, properly reflexive. The author does present what would be for us today a useful corrective of the notion, here attributed to Foucault, that psychoanalysis presumes the exteriority of the law to desire. Her rebuke, however, that in psychoanalysis there is no desire without the law that forms and sustains that very desire seems to imply that for a desire to emerge, there must first be a law passed prohibiting it. And this I believe to be a misreading of the process of the sublation of the symptom into the drive. Indeed, a traditional reading would probably invoke the castration complex, which the father, and then perhaps the symbolic order, introduces into the subject as semblances analogous to the law in question, which is understandable enough. However, the notion that each desire would have a corresponding prohibition elevated to a law merely to form that desire seems a gross extrapolation, even if such a situation were to have real correlates in terms of the prices, for instances, and the laws which safeguard private property. There is a reason why this is insisted on, for a desire is often not the consummation of the object itself, and indeed the author does seem familiar with the idea of renunciation as a kind of prohibition a subject may practice, which yet strengthens the effects of that which was renounced, if for no other reason than its scarcity. The point here is that we are often placed in a way in which a prohibition to an object is what creates the potential satisfaction experienced upon attaining it. And I do believe that this is a way in which Lacan formulates the object petit a. And of course, I should mention at this point that there have been various feminist critiques which, say that this is in some ways a eulogization of the penis, which perhaps Freud might have started with, into a phallus in the symbolic domain. And there are ways in which that critique can be read and responded to, if you prefer. The author, Judith Butler, does seem to be able to draft for us something resembling a preamble for that other, later Foucauldian project, a hermeneutics of the subject, which can allow for the inscription of the means via which interpellation in subject formation takes place, yet refuses to abandon the subject in their subjection, potentially lethal, like a deer caught under the headlights of an oncoming car. She secures for the subject in interpellation via its founding gesture, or rather by token of the price borne by the subject for it, a resistance which may be harbored by the subject. And this does appear to be prefiguring conceptual developments in the chapters to come, perhaps in the guise of a kind of self-consciousness or knowingness in interpellation, or as has been presented by later psychoanalytic practitioners, the use of social masks. And perhaps I should close with highlighting the injurious interpellations and the potential they bear of creating an identity through injury, which, even if not crystallized in identity, do provide for a history of a kind of trauma which may leave a scar. Now, in introducing this criticism of the chapter, I would like to make a few preliminary observations, having read out the text. One, that this does seem to be dealing with a certain kind of continuity in my critique, and in that sense, to be able to follow it, I would advise that you not merely listen to the earlier videos, but also read the blog itself. One of the reasons I presented these in the form of a video is to be able to reach out to new readers potentially on YouTube, but the form in which they were originally produced is the text. And while a medium such as video does allow me to be able to pause briefly and explain certain concepts which I believe a person coming across it at face value may struggle with, it does in some ways detract and divulge from the logic of the argument which is produced, which would require a careful reading to follow, and I can't emphasize this enough. Secondly, of course, I must say that if you do have criticisms, observations, suggestions regarding how this may be done differently, what else could have been focused or taken up on, if you have read Judith Butler, The Psychic Life of Power, or are familiar with some of the debates in the school, or just have any objections in general, I would welcome and entertain those. If you have comments, you may leave them below in the comments box, and I shall leave the link to the entirety of the text in the description. With that, I shall conclude this particular reading. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you have a lovely day, and I do intend to come back to you with a critique of chapter 4. Till then, bye bye. Take care.